Namaste and a very warm welcome to everyone gathered here today. I'm Lakshmi, a student from Department of Philosophy, Mahe Manipur. It's an honor to welcome you all today for the academic session. Mahe's Department of Philosophy plays a key role in promoting critical engagement and research in the humanities and social sciences with a strong emphasis on Indian knowledge systems. Through initiatives like Manisha, the department continues to foster dialogue, rigorous inquiry, and collaborative learning experience and disciplines. As part of this ongoing commitment, we are delighted to host a series of lectures and workshops that bring together scholars and students in meaningful conversations. We are honored to welcome Dr. Tarini Avasti, Assistant Professor of History at Flame University, Pune. Dr. Avasti holds a PhD in Asian Literature, Religion and Culture from Cornell University, a Master's in Modern History from JNU, and a Bachelor's in History from St. Stephen's College. Her work explores the intersection of late Sanskrit intellectual culture and post-colonial theory. She engages deeply with Mimamsa, Yoga, Vedanta, Tantra, Buddhist epistemology, and Rama narratives. Her published works include The Illustrated Ramayana in 2020 and The Contribution to Shakti and Exploration of the Divine Feminine in 2022, both from Penguin Random House. She also collaborates on projects related to Bhaskara Rai and Sri Vidya and has recently organized a text reading workshop on Appaya Dikshita at Flame University. Today, she will be speaking on Playing with Philosophy, some observations on the late second millennium in India. This talk invites us to reconsider how scholars in this period, such as Appaya Dikshita and Ayanatha, engaged playfully and profoundly with philosophical ideas, revealing new dimensions of thought, tone, and inquiry. We look forward to an engaging and thought-provoking session. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. So this is kind of building on some of what we were already talking about yesterday. We started thinking a little bit about how Bhaskar Rai, the 18th century Tantrika and Mimamsaka, seems to sometimes approach at least Advaita Vedanta in a way that's and I want to go back to some of those passages today, but that seems to be not entirely intended in the sense that he doesn't necessarily mean for you to buy into his rhetorical gesture, right? And we had a bit of a conversation yesterday about how distinctive it is for this period and so on. I want to talk today about three figures, and I think that they are in some ways related. Apayarikshita, Ayyana, and we'll maybe return to Bhaskar Rai at the end. Just to introduce them, Appaya Dikshit, I'm assuming everybody might be familiar with. He was a 16th century um, Advaitin, 5 days a week, some days of Shiva Advaitina, weekends. He is known for his commentary on Amarananda's sub-commentary on the Sharirika Bhashya of Shankara called the Parimala. He wrote the Siddhanta Lesha Sangraha, which was a text on Advaita Vedanta, which kind of tries to deal with different strands within Advaita Vedanta and how they address some questions. He also wrote a Nyaya Rakshamani, which is kind of like the protective jewel for Advaita logics. His major Mimamsa work is called the Vidhi Rasayana that I want to talk about a little bit today. In addition, he also wrote in a field called Shiva Advaita. So, from what we understand, there was a small ruler Chinnaboma who asked Appaya to compose a commentary on Sri Kantha's Brahmasutra Bhashya, and Appaya composed a text called the Shivarkamani Deepika. Larry Becker has written about the title Shivarkamani Deepika. The Arkamani Deepika is something that illumines the sunstone. But the illuminer of the sunstone, if you think about it, is really the sun. So Appaya Mekre argues is positioning himself in a position of authority with regard to Sri Kantha's text, which is to say, yeah, the stone is lying there, but my commentary, the sun, is going to come and it's going to blaze forth then. There is some controversy, there's some disagreement over how important Sri Kantha was before Appaya. We don't have to go into that. But Appaya also wrote another text called the Shivadvaita Nirnaya, where he says, if I may be a bit facetious, I know Srikantha looks like a Vishishtadvaitin. I know he sounds like one. I know he calls himself one. But in his heart of hearts, he's really not Advaitin. Appay also has this phrase that he likes, Hridayastha Muniyate, which is to say, I'm going to draw this out from the heart of the author I'm commenting on, which is to say, the author has not actually said this, but I would really like for him to have said this. So that's kind of his Shivadvaita works. Then he wrote these two stotras, the Ramayana Tatparya Sangraha and the Mahabharata Tatparya Sangraha. And in both of these, I think Ajay Rao has written about the Ramayana Tatparya Sangraha. Stotra. In both of these, he basically says that I know that the Ramayana and the Mahabharata sound like they're all about Narayana. Really, they're just about Shiva. And this is again something that around this time is becoming, I mean, it's becoming quite popular, which is that you take statements about either Shiva or Vishnu and you interpret it in terms of the other, right? It's a fairly robust industry in Shaiva and Vaishnava polemics. So that's the other side of Appaya. Then the other person I want to talk about is Ayyana, who might be slightly less known or entirely unknown. We only have one text by him, which is called the Matatraikya Prakashika, which is the illuminer of the unity of the three views. Um, Based on the people he cites as his teachers and so on, I suspect he's active in the 18th century. He's about contemporary to Bhaskara Rai, probably. And in this text, he says that I'm going to say that, and again, this is a common strategy by this point, that we're going to interpret Advaita's Shrutis figuratively, because he's Advaita, and we're going to take the Advaita Shrutis literally. Right? However, he does it in a way that tries to, like, he says Aikya, right? So he says, I'm going to establish that Ramanuja, Shankara, and Madhva really meant the same thing. Right? And I mean, he does it through commonly used strategies. But I want to talk about some of his, again, rhetorical gestures in the beginning of the work. I think I'll start with the Vidya Rasayana because I feel like that's a text I have the hardest time getting people interested in. So anything after that will seem very fun. The Vidya Rasayana deals with a question in Mimamsa of the typology of vidhis. Mimamsa acknowledges three kinds of injunctions or vidhis. We can talk about why I like to translate vidhi as injunction and not as command. These are, can I use the board again? Thank you. These are Apurva Vidhi, Niyama Vidhi, and Parisankhya Vidhi. Um, and please feel free to stop me at any point if you talk. This is very low tech, I'm sorry. We were already talking about these a little bit yesterday after the talk. So the Apurva Vidhi is, well, we'll talk about them with examples, but the Apurva Vidhi is an injunction which gives you completely new information, right? So if this injunction weren't there, you would not know to do what the injunction tells you to do. The classical example for Apurva Vidhi is Vrihidir Yajita, right? Or Vrihin Prokshati, right? One sprinkles the grains. If the Vidhi weren't there, you would never think of on your own to sprinkle the grains ever. And so it's completely new information. It's you can call it an injunction of I don't know injunction with a capital I because sometimes it's just called vidhi. An injunction of something that's not come up before. The second kind is called niyama vidhi, which is it's restriction, right? So the classical example is one pounds the grains with mortar and pestle, vrihin avahanti. Uh, why is it restriction? In the context of the ritual that we're talking about, you need these rice cakes. In order to produce the rice cakes, at some point you would have to pound the rice. Nobody apparently makes rice cakes with unhusked rice. Something you learn when you study Mimamsa. So you have to get the husks off somewhere or the other, right? But you could also have decided that you want to use your nails to do it. You could have decided to winnow it. I that's a way to get costs off. And you could have pounded it, right? So what this injunction does is that there is partial obtainment of pounding. There is a possibility that you might have decided to pound the grains anyway. What this injunction does it fills out the portion that is left, right? The phrase that Kumara uses is purana, right? So You may have done it by pounding. This tells you that you have to do it by pounding. Right? That's niyama, restriction. And the last vithi, which is my personal favorite, is parisankhya, an injunction of exclusion. And this is why it's my favorite. It's got a fun example. I think it's in the context of the Ashwamedha, but I could be misremembering. But there is a donkey and there's a horse, right? And both of them have reins, and you have to grasp both the reins. This much you know from the ritual context, right? This is arthat prapta. This is obtained based on exigency. However, there is a mantra that says Imam Agribhan Rashanamritasya. They grasp the reign of immortal of truth, whatever you want to call it. Iti Ashwavidhaniyam Adattu. So saying, one grasps the rein of the horse. Now, this is a problem. Why is this a problem? Because the mantra already should, that for the record, we can talk about this in later if anybody is interested. The context for this discussion in the Mimamsa, in the Shabar and Kumarila, is what is it that mantras do? Whether mantras have meanings or not. Anyway, to our discussion. So the mantra should already tell you that you have to grasp the reins, right? Because there are the reins, you have to take the horse and the donkey. The mantra should already tell you that you utter the mantra and you grasp the reins. What's the point of this extra statement, right? Either you can say, and we don't like for the Veda to be redundant, right? So you could say that it's Anuvada, but why only talk about the horse's rein? So they say that what this mantra tells you is that it excludes the donkey's rein. And there are reasons why it's not a problem because it blocks what is already obtained. But the idea is that even before you could think to use the mantra for both the horses and the donkey's rein, it tells you that you've got to use the mantra only when you grasp the rein of the horse. So that's an injunction of exclusion. Now, these definitions, I mean, these terms are there in the Mimamsa Sutras. Shabara has talked about them in the 5th, 6th century, whatever you want to date Shabara. Kumarika has an extensive discussion of this both in the mantra section and then again in the Grahikatva section later in the Mimamsa Sutra. And these definitions served everybody very well for the next 1000 years, well, 800 years, right? They become important, they feature in Vedanta discussions, as we were talking about in the evening yesterday, when people talk about whether certain statements in the Upanishad are vidhis or not, whether they're injunctions or not, and people try to work through that through these categories. Appaya in the 16th century prompted possibly by a much shorter discussion he has in the Shivarkamana Deepika, but prompted by absolutely nothing in Mimamsa, decides that he wants to write a 130-page text, deeply involved in why these definitions don't work. Right? And there are certain other elements of late period Mimamsa that I think really begin to feature prominently in this work. They're partly inspired by Vyasatirtha, but I think Abhay is a real mover. So what he does is he says, this is a definition, and I'm going to show you for the first 100 pages why this is a really bad, why all three definitions don't work. And he goes through every possible way of interpreting the verse in Kumarila which gives us these definitions. And then what he starts to do is that he starts pulling examples from Mimamsa, which are accepted as either any one of these categories. And he shows us why, according to each interpretation of Kumarila's, each of Kumarila's definitions, those injunctions would no longer fit into the category that we thought they would fit in, right? Or that they have been believed to have fitted. There is a bit of a catch here, which is that a century later, Shambhu Bhatta turns around. Shambhu Bhatta is a commentator on Khandadeva. We talked about Khandadeva a lot yesterday. Okay. So Shambhu Bhatta turns around and says, "Well, you're saying that this everybody knows this is the Niyam Bhakti. Nobody's ever called this a Niyam Bhakti. Like you just made this up. Nobody in Advaita or in Mimamsa has ever thought of this injunction that you're claiming to disprove the definition based on. Anyway, but but the thing that I want to point out in terms of late Mimamsa is that people start to approach the entire system, right? So those of you who might be unfamiliar with Mimamsa, Kumarila wrote the Shlokavartika on 1-1 of Mimamsa, which is the Tarkapada, which is all everybody seems to care about sometimes. And then he wrote the Tantravartika for from 1-2 till chapter 3, And then he wrote the Tuktika, right, which is a smaller kind of just, it's a tika. Right? He just comments when he wants to. He will launch into a long discussion once in a while. Usually he's quite brief there. In the reception of Mimamsa, even in a pre-modern context, there seems to be a bit of a split, right? So Sucharita, Umbedkar, they're only concerned with one. Mandana doesn't do a commentary, of course, which is it's not Mandana's style, but he's interested in questions in one, and he's just interested in the Bhavana section in 2:1. And then you have Parthasarathi who writes across the system, and you have Someshwara who only comments on the Tantravartika, but he doesn't comment on the Shlokavartika. This is all of this happens before the 14th century. I would be more precise with the dates, but I don't think anybody has a good handle on exactly when Parthasarathi and Someshwara were, except that they're after Sucharita, whatever that tells us. In any case, the point is that around with Vyasatirtha and really with Appaya, people start to reach beyond Tantravartika territory for their examples. So if one reads in Dhirasayana, it's just filled with examples from the ninth chapter, 10th chapter, which don't often feature in discussions of this kind. Well, also there is no discussion of this kind before Appaya, right? Nobody is rethinking Vidhi theory. Now, what he does, the reason why the Vidhi Rasayana is relevant for our conversation today, is because after he has done this for more than two-thirds of his text, he turns around and he says, well, actually, most of the text is Purvaksha, right? The Siddhanta is that I'm going to completely reinterpret Kumarila's injunctions, and then everything works, right? So he gives us new interpretations for the definitions that Kumarila gives us, and then he claims that now I've made the system work well. The interesting thing about the Vidyasayana is that everybody who responded in it, and there was a bit of a cottage industry of Vidyasayana responses in the 17th and 18th century, and responses to the responses of various lengths. So some very important authors responded to it in their larger Mimamsa works. Some wrote just independent text. I think the Vidyasayana Bhushana, for example. And then Chinna Appaya's grandkid wrote a great nephew, not grandson. He wrote a work called Dhruva Shikshana, teaching those with bad logics. So this was a very involved discourse for a couple of hundred years. And the interesting thing about this discourse is nobody takes the end of Appaya's text seriously. Everybody who addresses it, they address the first two-thirds, right? So they assume that the last bit, Appaya is only trying to show us that he can make it work if he wants to, and he's being, vaguely polite to Kumarila. He's not saying Kumarila was completely wrong. But everybody responds to Appaya as if he were saying that Kumarila is wrong. Right? So, in a sense, it seems that both Appaya and the people who respond to him understand that the end is kind of a polite, even playful gesture to Kumarila. The real, really what he's trying to say is in the first two-thirds of the text and so on. It's a text that I've been working on for some time. I've been reading for some years with Larry McRae. We're thinking of how to present this in a way that's, I mean, the actual, like, I gave the broad structure to actually present the discussions in it in a way that appeals to anybody that's not a Mimamsa nerd. But we'll get there eventually. So that's one work of our players. The other works that I want to touch upon, how many we're doing for time, right? We're not in a hurry. Are we in a hurry? The other works that I want to talk about maybe more briefly, in both the Ramayana and the Mahabharata works, he draws upon the way dhvani is discussed, right? You have the expressed meaning, which is not necessarily meant, and in good poetry, of course, the best thing must be that which is not overtly stated. And of course, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are the best kind of poetry. And so, if it says clearly that it's all about Vishnu, it must be about Shiva. Again, there's some disagreement over just how Appaya meant for this to be taken. It seems to stretch credulity that Appaya would really think that the Ramayana or the Mahabharata are really just all about Shiva in the way that he claims in these stotras. Appaya was also writing in a way in circles where he was. Again, all of the authors I'm going to talk about, it's less certain about Ayyana, but certainly Appaya and Bhaskara Raya expected to be and were read by people who did not agree, who outside of their schools. Appaya, of course, is hard to pin down to a school anyway. I sometimes wonder if Appaya had to live in an Advaita water, how that would have gone for him. But he expected, I think, to be read by Vishishtadvaitins and by Dvaitins and so on. He also, of course, wrote a commentary on one of Deshika's works, so clearly that's a world he knows well. I think he has some family connections also in that world. And of course, his works are responded to and read by people in all kinds of spaces. Um, it seems, again, I'm happy to talk about this more. It seems to me that, again, in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana works, he's just saying that look what I can do, right? I don't think he thinks this. I don't think he expects anybody to be inspired. It's a, yeah, it's a kind of, it's a game. It's an intellectual game, and he wants you to be in on it. In the Shivadvaita Nirnaya, I've already touched upon it a little bit. I want to talk for a second about the Shivarkamani Deepika, which is a much more conventional gesture in some ways, right? Which is the kind of thing that people have already, or we were talking yesterday about how people have already begun to do this with Shankara. To say that, well, he is really just a devotee of Vishnu, but he said these things for XYZ reasons, right? Appaya does something similar with Srikant and the Shivarkamani Deepika, where right in the opening he says, of course, Advaita, as taught by Shankara, is the truth. No question. But in order to have the Advaita Vasana, you need Shiva's grace. And in order to get that, you need to, you need to worship and you need to perform practices and you need to have devotion for Shiva. And for that reason, Srikanta has written this text. Of course, even Srikanta, in his heart, admits that Advaita is the truth. Now, the interesting thing to me about this work is that if Appaya had just commented on the Srikanta Bhashya, it would be one thing. Appaya does do, he engages with Advaita commentary on the Brahma Sutra Bhashya in at least two different words. Right? In both the Parimala on Avalananda and Avalananda's Kalpataru and in the Nyayarakshamani, which means that this is a kind of reading strategy which I see in a later period as well, which is the Brahma Sutra is one text, right? We want, of course, and Appaya says, and it's an old thing, that we want sutras to have many, for it to be possible for sutras to have more than one meaning. It's a virtue in a sutra in a way that it's not, for example, in a statement, right? There's supposed to be sort of, I think, Vishwamukha is the phrase that is used. Even so, to say that it's usually within the same system, right? There are a few passages in Mimamsa where the same set of two sutras are organized into different kinds of adhikaranas by Shavar, and that's kind of commented on by later people. But to say that the entire Brahma Sutra is legitimately read by Shankara one way, and I'm going to give you a like a commentary on that several times removed. And also that the entire Brahma Sutra can be read in a way that disagrees with that by Srikanta. And I'm also going to do a commentary on that. And I don't think that in any way makes me any less of an Advaita Vedanta. One that strikes one as a little unusual. But just in terms of what the status of the Brahma Sutras is, if the Brahma Sutra, and again, this leads into many things in the I think in the 19th and 20th century, when, or maybe even a little bit earlier, it relates in interesting ways with kind of Paul Hacker's kind of inclusivism that we were talking about yesterday. So he has so Abhay kind of deals with Mimamsa, Shaiva Shaiva and Vaishnava polemics, and to my mind, with at least two kinds of Vedanta in this way. To come to Ayana, let's in Ayana's work, what we see, I don't need the marker anymore. In Ayana's work, we see him proclaim right at the beginning that I'm going to establish that there is a unity of all these three views, right? That Madhvacharya, Shankaracharya, and Ramanujacharya really mean the same thing. And we were going to think about the different. What he says is the arguments that are the differences in there. We're going to not think about them very much because they're inconsequential, right? The differences between Shankara, Ramanujan, and Madhva. Now, if this were his opening and he kind of then jumped into making them all work, it would be one thing. It would be an interesting work, but I would say it's kind of the strategies he uses get repetitive after the first few sort of cycles, and you could say that it's fairly standard um, inclusivism in some ways. But what he does is that he gestures to why this is a strange thing that he's doing, right? So the to my mind, the normal way to do this would be to say, well, of course that is what Ramanujan and Shankara say, right? He makes a theme. He spends 2.5 pages talking about the Sankhya and Mimamsa of all things to establish why it's okay for him to do this. And he also invokes an alankara, which the Ulekha alankara, which we'll talk about in a second, again to justify this exercise, right? So one, it's an exercise that needs justification. Two, again, I don't think anybody on any side who's going to read it is going to buy into this. It's interestingly this, or maybe not so interestingly, this text doesn't circulate very much. I think there's only one or two manuscripts of it. The transcript, by the way, the whole thing is available on Muktabooth if anybody's interested in looking at it. So this is how he says that there's an objector who says that the thesis that I am composing the Matatrayakya is impossible because it is blocked by the fact established in the principle of section of the Sankhya that due to the introduction of difference, there would be a difference in act based on number. And so one number cannot imply a difference corresponding with its locus, which is co-referential with it. We don't have to work through all of that. But the idea is that you can't say that something that's three is really one, right? He goes on to one first present an alternative, sort of talk more about the Sankhya and say why this is not a problem for him. But more, to my mind, maybe slightly more interestingly, he then says, but also this is okay because there is an alankara, there is a figure of speech called the ullekha, and he's reading clearly Appaya in this passage because he quotes almost directly from there that you can actually talk about one thing in many ways, right? So he's basically saying that the prameya is the same, they're only coming at it from different positions, and so I can say that based on the unity of the prameya, there is unity of the three views. The example, by the way, if anybody's interested, that he cites for Ullekha is Brihaspati in speech, Arjuna in fame, and Bhima in Sharasana, which is a pun on lying on the bed of arrows, and also bow. And he was seen to be a fulfilling tree by women and those seeking desired objects, and death by enemies. And then he, of course, also talks about so a few other examples from other systems. But the idea is that he invokes this Alankara thing, he invokes Mimamsa. He's trying to set this up as he seems to make a point of showing that this is a slightly strange thing for him to be doing. Um, I don't know whom Ayana expected to be read by. Like I said, I don't think he was actually read, in fact, by that many other people. To write such a text for a Madhva audience, I mean, there are people here who know how that could have been responded to better than I can. They're not going to suddenly start thinking of Shankara as right. They might take like the figurative interpretation of Shruti and so on, so you see, but that's already been around for some time. Um, no Advaita is going to be suddenly convinced that Shankara really meant some of these things in a figurative way. Although again, this fits in nicely with the strategy with Shankara that we were talking about. That everybody wants to claim some piece of Shankara's authority. But that's the Matatrayakya. And then I want to touch upon Bhaskar Rai a little bit again. Just to think about his audiences. To my mind, the Bhaskar Rai's Tantra works, again, Douglas Brooks has suggested that Bhaskar Rai was a Tantrika writing exclusively for a Tantrika audience, and you can never tell that he's ever engaged in another system by reading his Tantra works. That seems to me to be mistaken. Just because one, Bhaskar Rai's Tantra works are saturated with his engagement with Mimamsa, his exposure to Navinaya and so on. And also because if Bhaskar and Raya were writing just for a Tantra audience, these would, to my mind, one, who is the kind of Tantrika that Bhaskar Rai is addressing? Right? Presumably, he's thinking about Smartas who are also Shividya practitioners, which Elaine Fisher has talked about competently in her work. If that is his audience, there obviously there are Shankara Advaitis, or at least they have some kind of an allegiance to Shankara Advaita in some capacity. So they're not just Shividya practitioners. They're reading other things. They're exposed to and probably hold other views. So it seems so. It's not for a closed, and he also seems to want to address um, Mimamsakas and so on, because again, he's introducing things into the Tantra discussion. Like I was saying yesterday, for example, when he talks about having equality with the God, equality with gods in cosmic operations, right? He's introducing that discussion out of nowhere. Nobody within Tantra has ever thought that it's at all relevant. Similarly, in the example of the twa suffix that we talked about yesterday, um, if you were writing just for a Tantra audience, there was really no reason to bring that in. It doesn't serve the, it's not defeating anybody, it's not like he's countering the Mimamsa view. He's just trying to make, to my mind, Tantra fit in better with quote unquote more mainstream Sanskrit philosophy. Right? He's trying to write about Tantra in a way that Mimamsakas and Advaitins would engage with it, at least Advaitins. In that context, he gives us what I was talking about yesterday, this discussion of um, this difference between the Tantrika position and the Advaita position or the Upanishadic position on the question of whether the world is real or not. The interesting passage there, to my mind, apart from the things I already talked about, is that he gestures also to Appaya's Shivadvaita Nirnaya, where Appaya is using the same quotations in a very similar context. So the quotations are in the Sankhepa Shariraka, which says the consciousness capacity of the Supreme Lord is immaculate and is called consciousness alone. And there are two verses from excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm blanking out. From Sarvajnatmanam, Atman, which are also quoted by Appaya, where he's talking about the exact same issue, right? Except from the other angle. So Appaya, we know, was very closely involved with the Shakti Vishishta Advaita. At least he was very well exposed to it. Again, Fisher has an article about this. I think it's called Remaking South Indian Shaivism or something like that. And so what he's trying to do is he's trying to use um, stray verses in Shankara's followers. Appaya, I'm talking about Appaya now. In the Shivadvaita, he's trying to use stray examples from Shankara's followers to show that the things that Srikanta is saying, for example, about Shakti, actually do map or can be drawn from Advaita works as well. Right? That's the first step that Appaya has already taken. Bhaskar Rai comes along and he knows Appaya backwards and forwards. I think he expects his audience to know Appaya at least a little bit. He takes those same two verses and uses them in a very similar context to show basically the exact opposite, right? Whereas Appaya was trying to show that Srikanta's views are not contradictory to Advaita, and Advaita Vedanta of Shankara is ultimately true. Bhaskar Rai turns them back and he says, and he uses those passages to say that Advaita Vedanta has been misunderstood by literally all of its followers ever, and actually it is in conformity with the kind of Shaiva Shakta perspective that I have, which is that the world is a transformation of Shakti, and it's ultimately real. So that's one of the ways in which the Bhaskara seems to want to draw upon Appaya, and again, to me, this seems quite playful, which is that, and he's fond of Appaya, Bhaskara, clearly. He cites him approvingly in many places. He is obviously influenced by him in how he approaches various things, especially if you look at his Mimamsa work, his Mimamsa commentary on Khandadeva. The section on Smriti draws extensively on Appaya's discussion in the Shivarkamari Deepika of how tantras and Shaiva texts and so on can feature in that world. So he clearly knows Appaya well, he likes Appaya, and he also chooses once in a while to take something slightly unusual that Appaya is doing and turn it around and use it in a completely opposite direction. So that's kind of the broad this is kind of broadly the kind of tendencies that I want to talk about. Again, Bronner and Becker in their book First Words, Last Words have talked about how Appaya does similar things with certain Mimamsa principles in some of his rhetoric, in some of his engagement with Dvaita Vedanta. Um, the point that I want to make, and I want to also refer maybe briefly to this 20th century figure called Kanchanana Tarkaratna, who is kind of, it seems, influenced by all of these things. Like, he probably knew Bhaskara Rai well. He was born in Bengal. He was a Sri Vidya practitioner who gives us a reading of the entire Brahma Sutra from a Shakta perspective. And he says he makes very similar gestures to what we see in Appaya or in Bhaskara Rai or in Ayyanam. So in the opening, he says basically that I know I'm going to spend most of my time in this work disagreeing with Shankara. However, these are all to be understood in terms of adhikara, the difference in eligibility. And of course, the sayings of the great people like Shankara transcend the world, and we have no issue with them really, right? He says in another work called the Dvaitokti Ratnamala, the pearl string of statements of duality, that I know in this work I'm going to defend duality. Of course, I really believe that reality is non-dual. But I'm going to do it in order to show that Nyaya and this is a whole other thing. But he basically says I'm going to do this to show that Nyaya and Vaisheshika actually fit in well with the larger Shrauta world. And so I'm going to talk about duality. And then he raises a question, right? He says, but what if people take your statements about duality seriously and they start to use it for, they start to incorporate these views in their practice. If you really think that non-duality is real, how will this work? You're leading people astray. And he says, no, that's okay. If they do these practices, then because the goddess will see that they're sincere, she'll make it work for them, right? But back to his kind of his Shakti Bharti, his commentary on the Brahma Sutra, he not only gives us a whole comment, so he has two components to his commentary. One is he has this kind of um, Vishishtadvaita inspired, but not quite Vishishtadvaita view of how Shiva and Shakti, or how Brahman and Shakti relate to each other and to the world. And then he also has a Sri Vidya reading for each of the Brahma Sutras, or at least in one. So basically, he'll give you his reading in accordance with his kind of larger metaphysics, and then he'll add a kind of second reading. If you're a Sri Vidya practitioner, how you should read this sutra. And in that reading, he will incorporate how it relates to the Sri Vidya mantra, how it relates to various tantras, how it relates to pre-existing Sri Vidya commentaries. So it seems to me that this is a tendency that extends over about at least 500 years, if not further back, as Carl suggested yesterday. Um, but this kind of play, and I'm not sure what to make of it. One way of thinking about this play is that in this period, if you think about how it operates in this period, there has been such a proliferation, especially in terms of Advaita and Dvaita and Vishishtadvaita polemics. There's been such a proliferation of texts that everybody is in on the game, right? Sincerity becomes really hard. So if you look at, for example, the way they treat Puranas, right? In the Shikharani Mala and the text that he's responding to, or that is a response to it. They stop rejecting each other's Puranas, right? They say because if you that's a very dangerous game. If you start saying that this Purana is completely out of the pale, then your Purana can be kicked completely out of the pale. So you can't do that. So you have to make it work. So it becomes a world where there is just so much out there that you have to come up, and that's one of the again that's one of the reasons why in Mimamsa as well there's so much out there that you're not writing just a straight up commentary on Shabara anymore. Now you're beginning to reinterpret things. And so to me, it marks also certain degree of, I mean, yeah, it marks a certain moment in the history of Sanskrit intellectual culture too. That's kind of broadly where I want to leave it at, and maybe we can talk more in the questions. Is that okay? Um, I don't know.
Well, there's plenty, I guess, nobody takes the mic. I mean, since I am not aware very much of the Shaivites, Tantra, and so forth, so to me it's very anecdotal, right? It's this person, this one. So I'm somebody who often has a more of a meta perspective, and then you just conclude it with it, right? And this,
Right.
so I would like you to say more about that.
Okay. About which bit?
This, so you say it brings us to a new kind of
Right.
era in this literature or new way of doing. So tell me what it is. I would like to see.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still, I'm still working this out in some ways. A little bit has been done in the context of Mimamsa by Mekra, and we were talking yesterday about Wright, who has written about this in the context of Nyaya, which is there begin to be these really involved Prodapatras in the 17th century and so on, where they're dealing with tiny issues and great sophistication. I think in sort of these words, where I mean thinking just in terms of Mimamsa and certain strands within Vedanta. For the record, not everybody has gotten into um, this way of this playful way of dealing with the Brahma Sutras or with the Puranas. Like most people aren't writing like this, but there is a certain um, tendency among certain circles. I think one of these things is that, like I said, in Mimamsa, it leads to you want to reach further. For examples, you want to make not just the Tantra Vartika sections work. You want to go into the seventh chapter, the ninth chapter, the 11th chapter, which include questions, which haven't really featured prominently in Mimamsa discourse before the 16th century or so. So that's one. The other thing that it does, I think, is it makes, in some ways, even though there's still really strident polemics between Shaivas and Vaishnavas, um, to my mind, it opens a way for certain tendencies in the 19th and 20th centuries, again, which we see in Tarkaratna, for saying things. So when Tarkaratna has that conversation that has that discussion I mentioned about how, in the way, how it will work because of the goddess's grace, right? Whichever way you go. He makes a similar case for resolving Shaiva and Vaishnava disputes, right? And I think this period where people are kind of reading same passages different ways in a way that wants everybody to be in on the game and so on, I think that opens up the way for that. It's also, I don't want to sort of touch the hornet's nest of when Hinduism came to be, but of when Hinduism came to be. And I think there is a case to be made for a very long period for thinking of all of these as part of the same broader system. I don't think that they were just sectarian. But it does kind of, we have gestures like this in a much earlier period, right? Both Kalidas and Bhartrihari have things like, Bhartrihari says, well, either Shiva could be the Lord of the world, sorry, I'm talking about Bhartrihari the poet. Either Shiva could be the Lord of the world or Vishnu could be, but I like Shiva, right? Or Kalidasa says that they're all, in the Kumarisam, they're all equal, and depending on the occasion, they assume sort of a hierarchy, whichever way it works in that moment. We have gestures like that, but this kind of a systematic engagement with how we can use the same Purana for two different purposes. Again, I think it allows for certain um, tendencies like we see in Tarkaratna and in a broader Hindu world in the 19th, 20th century.
I would have a follow-up question if nobody right now has busy song. But on the actually, it's again meta perspective.
Sure.
You,
No, this was very helpful actually.
That's where I.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful because I have the opposite problem of getting bogged down in the weeds.
Okay, well, I try to engage with that. That's the only way I can, and it's meant to be dialectical, right? So it's kind of to come back on something you said yesterday, and then, following on what you said today. Yesterday, you said that your presentation and work somehow tries to, challenge the idea that, after, let's say, 12th century, uh, literary and philosophy-wise in India, there has been not so much happening new, that you somehow try to challenge this idea that, let's say, after the golden age is kind of stagnation, right? In my perspective, you kind of show the opposite, and that's what I want to. That's why I say it's dialectics. What I mean is that when I hear all of this, and it's not at all to mean it's not interesting, right? And some new here and there, but it's a constant reshuffling of the same cards. So there is no originality. So nobody comes and says, there is no soul. All of this is not there. There's no opposition to the established view, if you want. And then there is a constant attempt to reshuffle the same card by saying that, oh, this perspective is better, all of them together, or just this one, just this one, just this one, but it's the same thing. Just on and on and on and on again. And I think when people say there is stagnation after 12th century, that's what they mean. And to me, this is somewhat what you show, that that's the stagnation, in the sense there is no critique, there is no outside of this. You're either with that sect or that sect or that group, and you show that you read it better, more or less, but nothing against it, if you want, right? So how would you respond to this?
Okay. So a couple things. One, I thought we no longer thought that there was nothing interesting about after the 12th century. I thought there was nothing. We were now in the space where there's nothing interesting after the 15th century. But we can take the 12th. I'm not committed.
I say 12 because that's when normally Buddhists are out.
Okay, that's how we're counting.
I mean, that's how I just put it in that sense.
Okay, I mean, I think 12th is a bit early, even for people who are not me. I would take, but so I would say a few different things. One, to the question of, I'll do it bit by bit, right? On the question of you belong to this school or the other. In fact, of the four people that I talked about today, except for Ayyana, none of them. I mean, they're Appaya is kind of card carrying, but really, in some ways, none of them really fit into any of the existing schools. Um, it's an interesting phenomenon to my mind that most of the writing in Advaita Vedanta that becomes significant in this period is being done outside the mathas, which is very different from what happens in Dvaita, right? So somebody like an Appaya Dikshita is actually not, I mean, he is an Advaita Vedantin, but he is saying things that would be quite problematic to people within a school. In fact, Nilakanta Chaturdhar, the commentator in the Mahabharata, wrote a text called the Vedanta Kataka, the kind of the purifier of Vedanta, which Minkowski has an article on, where he basically turns around and says, well, Appaya doesn't fit into Advaita Vedanta. He's like a pseudo Vishishta, right? So similarly for Bhaskara actually had no affiliation at all to any formal school. Srividya was not a school of philosophy in a systematic way in which you can think about Advaita Vedanta and so on. And so Bhaskara was in some, not entirely, but in some ways he really was setting up this new salvific and metaphysical system, right? So it's not that he was simply subscribing to a school and defending the views of that school or shuffling the cards around, right? Ayana is slightly different from the other two, and we can talk about him separately. Tarkaratna was actually saying that all of the other Vedantas are wrong, and I have this relationship between Brahman and Shakti. That to my mind, I actually haven't seen similar views elsewhere. We can talk about what they are in detail. So in fact, none of them actually are from school, right? That's one. The second thing then is that, especially for the 16th to 18th century, if you, I mean, this applies all across the board, I guess. I think we sometimes take a very narrow view of what should count as philosophical innovation. Um, if Appaya is working through five different views, if he's working, for example, through what five different Advaitins say on the same question, for example, how reflection works, right? Different perspectives in Pratikam, but if he's working through them in detail, And then if he's trying to interpret them in a way they work or they don't, I don't think that's necessarily stagnant. What he's doing with the Vidhi Rasayana, I think, is actually completely unprecedented. Just because he's dealing with the same system doesn't mean that his reorganization of injunctions is not significant, including philosophically significant, right? Because again, he's talking about how you cognize obtainment in a particular sentence, right? Or like we were talking about yesterday about Khandadeva and how he understands Mathuvartha Lakshana, right? The connotation of the figure of the possessive affix in Somena Yajeta, it's not just a point about an obscure ritual statement. It's a point about how we understand innocent tense, karakas, and the verb construe with one another, and how. Similarly, in the Vidhi typology, it's not just it's a question of how you understand what it is that you cognize in a sentence, what it is that you would have cognized from the context already, and whether or not, and what part of a sentence affects your performance of the ritual. Right. So I don't think these are just kind of nerdy Mimamsa examples. I think they relate to larger questions. And they are written about in that way, especially Apaya in moments, and Khandadeva is entirely saturated with Navinaya terminology and ideas. Does that at all?
Yeah, I
Yes.
mean, I'm not a nerd in that, but I did study.
No, I mean, does that at all respond to what you
That's what you mean. I mean, I think it's meant to be a debate type of, it's not something we close on.
I don't think, but
I mean, I understand innovations, but to me, it's innovation within a same set. You see, so that's why I use the reshuffling of
Sure.
So it's not, let's say, nobody gets out of, let's say, certain, that's perhaps in that sense we proof we are moving toward Hinduism, that one instance you were talking about, but there is a certain set. Apparently, the originality here is the Tantra is giving more places than in older days. You would hardly see serious engagement, I guess, in more orthodox than older Tantra. That's, so Tantra is becoming a bit more orthodox, but that will happen, yeah, in other I think in Buddhist circles as well, Tantra is
Sure.
integrated.
But
Yeah, so to me it seems that somehow, I don't know if I can make a metaphor, but if it could use, I remember going to Jaipur Literature Festival, it was 2012 or something. And, a lot of the art that was exposed was a version of another of Buddha's face. Right? And I thought, it's been 2,000 years of painting that face, right? When you put it on the table, you make it into something for the bathroom, different way, and they see there is a form that's there, constantly being reused in art, and that's just the Buddha's face. Then you have all these motifs that just continue and continue in some way. That's what I mean by and it's for the sake of conversation.
yeah, I know. I mean,
It's a thought that arises as you opened that window yesterday, and it made me think, and I'm sharing that with you.
Yeah.
It's not the finished. But to me, if I was to understand stagnation, it would mean that there's a set of forms and they don't move, but we just play with them differently. We engage with them in new ways, but they stay, accepted. There's no challenge. There is.
So here's my question then.
Yeah.
I mean, there's two. Let's do it through Bhaskar Raya. What of the form of Mimamsa, as it was for Kumarila or even for Parthasarathi, do you think is retained in Bhaskar Raya?
Well, we have to read them closer,
Okay. Yeah,
right? But
sure,
I guess
sure.
the fact that it is Mimamsa, right? That you would go with, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, sure.
So that there is a set way of reading, well, there's this amount of reading, there's this, the meaning of the statements, I guess, the Arthavada and so forth and so
Sure.
forth. Must be
But
engaged.
again, on the question of Arthavada, for example, I mean, Vedanta's, let's not go to Veda, but Bhaskar Rai, for example, on the question of Arthavada, on the question of Smriti, on the question of Bhavana itself, right, the fact that he reinterprets Bhavana in terms of the will of the goddess, sure, he looks like he's kind of just, he's keeping the system, but to my mind, it's a fairly radical kind of not just a reinterpretation, but kind of a reframing of the system. I'm not sure if that, to your mind, counts is still shuffling the same
So,
cards.
may I
Sure,
just add,
sorry.
sorry, I don't know these
Not at
facts
all.
very well, but so it would be helpful if you could say a clear difference, right?
Okay.
So you're saying Mimamsa from Kumarila and these later
Right.
texts. So what did Kumarila say on, say, nature of the textual authority?
Right.
Is that disbanded later? Probably not, right? Nature of practice and some certainty.
Right.
Like, what is it clear, and is there, I guess since you talked about the hornet's nest, I think it's what, like, sometimes the comparison with Europe is illuminating. There, the point is the sectarian difference always linked to some social political thing, right? That seems to have not happened, and that's the real break in Europe with the Protestants.
Yeah.
So any new theological idea was simultaneously political. That seems to, is it, I mean, you know this, whether that's clearly not happened here, right? And it never happens.
Well, yes. I mean, it doesn't affect that kind of a break. That is absolutely true. I think this has been commented on extensively that Sanskrit philosophers, their writing is shockingly insular, even if they do other things at other times. Right? That is true. However, that was true in the 7th century as well. What I would add to that is that the mainstreaming of Tantra in some ways, through Lakshmidhar and Bhaskara Raya, and the mainstreaming of Bhakti, in a sense, in Sanskrit, right, in the works of Vallabha or in the works of the Gaudiya commentators, um, does it doesn't break the system, but it kind of makes room within the system, right? So, for example, Bhaskar Raya talks about um, the so expansion of canon in this system goes hand in hand with expansion of eligibility, right? Because the argument for restricting eligibility is that not everybody has access to Shruti. So once you expanded the canon beyond Shruti, when when the Pramanas kind of include Tantras or Puranas and so on, then you also expanded eligibility to a certain extent. So, but that doesn't really speak to your question. At the same time, that also doesn't mark, to my mind, a huge difference from what was happening in the first millennium, right? That's a characteristic which I agree with you distinguishes what happens in Sanskrit intellectual culture um, as opposed to European. In the
In the
same
first medium, at least you had multi-players. See, that's why I put it at 12th century where the stagnation begins, because you have at least people who have a completely divergent worldview, right? And they are mainstreams. They have, if you want, the consequence on the social organization of the land, the people. Eventually, they go in conflict. Even. They fight each other.
Do you think Bhakti and Mimamsa don't have a conflicting worldview? They disagree on how the texts are interpreted. They disagree on metaphysics. They disagree on soteriology.
Yeah, I would agree with you that Bhakti is something new, what we derive, in my view, by the time that the Muslims arrive in India.
Okay,
I mean, a bit before.
but I mean, you see
invasion,
the tendencies already in. Again, I'm working against myself a little bit, but when Bhakti arrives or not, but I think there are multiple players that persist in the field. The Buddhists drop out, but the rest of them are still around, and there are a lot of them. I don't think there is a lack of diversity, surely, in this period.
So what is the difference? That's what I'm
Between Bhakti and Mimamsa,
yeah,
for
like what's
example?
the theorization of Bhakti? Right? It's not just to say as a social
Right.
philosophy.
No, not at all.
So beyond saying my God is bigger than yours, basically. Like how is it? Like, what's the argument? Like what's innovative in the argumentation? What in terms of, like, say, textual authority, modes of inference specifically?
Right. So,
no, I'm just asking.
No, I know.
But actually, Ajay Rao came some years ago, and the same conversation, I think, similar happened. But it's like not able to make it interesting beyond, like, say, Mike with Shiva and Vishnu. Like, beyond that, okay.
But that's actually not what the, I mean, that's only a small part of what this is.
So what is new?
Right, okay.
What's new in terms of, like, let's say the Buddhists, at least they, there's no anti-ritual, the proper textual authorities, so those are massive. This has now become more conservative, arguably, right? Even if that canon is expanding, it's back to like.
The case for textual authority actually does shift over the centuries, right? So you see in Yamuna, so Kumarila basically says that, oh yeah, so there's an old story. So Kumarila says that Smrit and Shabar and general, Mimamsa in general believes that validity of Shruti, or validity of Smriti is based only in the fact that it is grounded in Shruti, right? So there is Smriti statements are valid only because we infer that there must be a root Shruti there, right? That's why often Shruti and Smriti are called Pratyaksha and Anumana. Yamuna makes a case for the inclusion of the Pancharatra texts in the Agama of Pramana. However, he still grounds it more or less on the same kinds of arguments that Kumarila has. Around the middle of the second millennium, you start to see two things. One is that Puranas are explicitly claimed to be more authoritative than Shruti, right? Lakshmidhara does this in the Bhagavan Nam Komati. But two, the basis for the authority does shift in this period, right? Which is to say, in a way that would have been deeply problematic to Mimamsakas, less problematic to Naiyayikas. Divine authorship begins to play a role, right? The fact that the Bhagavad Gita, for example, was uttered by God, right, and not just the fact that it is Smriti, it's part of the Mahabharata, becomes important, right? You see also in figures like Vallabha, for instance. So Vallabha kind of up, he turns this around a little bit. Aditya Chandravedi has been working on this. On Sure, we have the Pramanas, right? We have Shruti, Smriti, we have the Veda, we have the Bhagavata, we have the Bhagavad Gita, and so on. But he actually says the later of them is actually more important as Pramana than the earlier ones because that's the one that allows us to, that's the one that more precisely determines the meaning. These changes seem quite fine grained, but they do tie up with larger processes in terms of, I mean, I think larger societal processes as well, but I'm not an expert in that. But larger processes in terms of who gets to access the practices, and also in terms of, and so that's one thing. The other thing is the way that they understand and articulate the practices themselves, right? And the practices that are pursued. For example, the kind of world that the Gaudiyas create and the aesthetic theorization that comes with it, right? That Himamans talk about. So I don't know if that at all.
Thank you.
I mean, it's a big, let's say, and also I put you, sorry, this,
No,
situation
this is
where you
extremely
have to
helpful.
defend it.
Not at all.
It's just
I want to be put into that.
you kind of got the opportunity, and I think it's an interesting conversation to have. To me, you're given, see, if I was to make a comparison, I would take Christian theology, and you could see it's very diverse, and it breaks in many parts. Right? At some point, there's a schism, you have Protestant also breaks down, you have so many subsects, and then you have within the Catholics, you have the monasteries, you have the church itself. They all have different access to power. They all have different theology. They insist on that, they insist on that.
Right.
And they are all Christian. All right? Now, within the historical frame, if you take of Europe, that will be challenged in itself. Out of this Christian, for example, worldview will come ideas like human rights, for example, but that are completely outside of the scope of theology, right? And they derive, but with humanism, rediscovery of the classics and so forth, then there's a rejection, right? And we can find these cuts and say, well, actually, there's a strict attempt to innovate and think outside the church, right? And in that sense, society tries to liberate it. That's the
We
language.
never had a church. I think that's the difference.
But that's
We didn't have a church.
yeah. I mean, but even the idea of a church, I think in Europe it's kind of a lie. There is a church, but within the church there are many groups of powers that have their influence. I was looking for it's just as we talk. To me, when I hear a long continuity of all these authors that engage, and it's interesting, Bhakti, Tantra, Mimamsa, and so forth. Mimamsa has to be, all over. I mean, that's the foundation of the planet, right? You have have to have Mimamsa.
Depends on whom you ask. Rupa Goswami says that you should protect your bhakti from Mimamsakas the way you protect a gem from thieves.
But for the, right, okay, from the perspective, all right, that is in a sense, but the theology is still the same.
In what way?
Well, the gods, right,
For Mimamsakas?
well, no, well, yeah, it's in the sense, yeah, okay, only the Vedas or the gods, right, but it's the gods or the god, right, we're still in a kind of
So this
same
question
theology.
is positioned on the Devatodesha practices that exist in the Samhita and
Sure.
Brahmana part. So that why the Devatodesha exists? If there is no theological
Within Mimamsa? Is that the question? About
I didn't
Oh,
understand I didn't understand the input. Sorry.
no, you mean to say that the Bhakti tradition has a focal point that's the core religion within the six religious centers of Hindus or Vedic system. Now, whereas in the case of Mimamsa, the karma has to focus, the focal point of the karma has to be something. Like, so these people that the so-called divine beings, if they are there, then what is the theological difference between the Bhakti movement and the Mimamsa movement? Is that your question?
Well, it's somehow, how can I say, related. I agree or not that this God is exactly like this or that there is no God and so forth. They all share this kind of devata, right?
no, it's not the Mimamsakas share the Devata in rejecting it. In that they reject it. They do not share the Devata.
But they reject the absolute devata.
No, they reject the Devatas as well. But like, obviously they're not real.
So his question is, what is the role of the? Sorry if I'm twisting your question.
I also had a different thing to say which I have not forgotten.
So in the Mimamsa position, even if it is within Kumandala, what is the role of the karma if the Devata, the Devatas, the Devagana, that is what is explicit in the Samhita Bharata, if they are going to be rejected, sublated at a point of time, then what's the role of the ritual towards?
Okay, well, I'll get to that, but I wanted to respond to some of what we were talking about before. I want to say something to that as well. But yeah, what I forgot I wanted to say was what we do see again in the 19th and 20th century, and I tried to show.
Sorry. I'm very sorry, yeah.
It's a centralized one.
You can't do anything.
Okay.
No, sorry, please.
Sorry, no.
We're going to the shared.
Give me 1 second. I need to. Yes. So one thing that to the question of responding to larger shifts and so on. One thing that I have been kind of fiddling with for some time is people have explained the 19th century, late 19th, early 20th century invocation of yoga in by this point of and the studies of modern yoga are, they're all over the place. But I think that the invocation of yoga by people like Vivekananda, for instance, and as well as in later periods, was in some ways a response to this. So this kind of this, and Schwartz has talked about how this proceeds in the last few centuries before the 19th, which is that the advantage that yoga gives us is that it gets us out of the Mimamsa mode, right? So pairing yoga more closely with Advaita in the later period is in some ways a way of getting out of the problems that Mimamsa creates for systems like Advaita Vedanta. Because the Yoga Sutras just do not care about eligibility. Right? Instead of starting out with who has eligibility also on this, well, this is what you can do, and this is where you want to get. If you want to do it, you do it. If you don't, you don't. Right? So I think yoga, especially in the 19th, 20th century, is important in that context, and that does have a bit of a prehistory before. To what you were saying, the status of the Devata and Mimamsa and why there is a Devata in some type of. They see devatas as kind of as subordinate elements of the sacrifice, right? The sacrifice is oriented towards, it's not oriented towards the devata, it is oriented um, towards bhavana and phala. So devatas are, to them, they're like this, they're just subordinate elements that feature in the sacrifice. And we can't get rid of them because Shruti is obviously infallible, but they're not, they're not real entities.
So if it is, I'm sorry, Arvind wanted to ask a
Oh,
question.
sure,
He
sure,
has been telling since then, so I'll get back to this later.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, so I don't, my familiarity with all these texts is nil. So, but I'm curious. I teach at the Department of Languages here. My minimal background is in European philosophy, but still, I'm interested to know. One thing is, I'm aware that Janardhan Ganeri edited this book called The Lost Age of Reason. I suppose you have been speaking about the same philosophy. Am I right? The Gaudiya.
I mean, I've been talking less about the Gaudiyas, but some of what I said pertains to some of the same period, sure.
Right. So my question is, what is modernity to you in Indian philosophical thought? Because you have been using the same time periods used by the Westerners. So the 18th century, the 17th century. What is modernity in your understanding?
So you caught me out a little bit because I avoid studiously the use of the terms modern and modernity when I talk about this.
Yeah, but you mentioned the like something about early modern and all of that
Right.
at the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, just to kind of designate the period.
Precisely. My problem. I know that this has been done to death by by post-colonial scholars and all of this. But I have not read Ganeri's book. Too abstruse for the likes of me. But I would like to know what is this early modern according to you? What do you mean by that?
So when I say early modern, I mean it's avivakshitartha. Meaning that I don't intend for the I don't intend its meaning. It's avivakshita. I mean it as just a placeholder, and I say this for two reasons.
But for it to be a placeholder, what does it?
I understand.
What, yeah.
I understand. I use it as a placeholder because it's what everybody uses to designate this period. I have issues with this term for two or three reasons. One is that very often talk of even of sort of modernity in Indian thought, even when we acknowledge an early modern, depends on a rupture in the 18th century. There's the early modern and then there is colonial modernity, and the two have relatively little to do with each other. And some of what I've been trying to show in my dissertation, which will never be published as a book because I hate it, is that there are certain tendencies that we see in this longer period between the 16th and 20th century. And that's why I find the term early modern to be less useful because I want to talk also about the 19th and 20, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. People have talked about certain tendencies like an awareness of sort of newness and so on and so forth. And my position on talking about modernity in this period is that we have read only a tiny fraction of intellectual production in this period. We are not in a position to assess what the early modern or even looks like, and therefore what colonial modernity looks like in relation to it. I don't think we're in a position to make that, or at least I'm not in a position to make that judgment. I don't think we as a community are, which is a cop out. You should call me out at more. But yes.
No, but no, sorry to interrupt, but Carl and Nikhil have been reiterating this point that there has, I mean, the stagnation began at a certain point and it has continued, and you have been trying to go against that. All of it, this is fine, but my question is again, intellectually speaking, or even in terms of because Advaita and Dvaita, these are all about spirituality. Is that right?
I don't know what that means.
Okay. But what about Jivatma, Paramatma, whatever, Brahman?
Okay.
These are all metaphysical entities.
Sure.
Right? So what is the intellectual position that these scholars take vis-a-vis these metaphysical entities? Is there anything different in what they did and from what, let's say, Kumarila did, or Gaudapada did, or Shankara did? Is there anything different?
Uh, I would say yes. I would say in Tarkaratna certainly there is a difference because I mean he has whole other metaphysics. Similarly, I think the Gaudiya Vaishnavas too have their own metaphysics that does not correspond exactly. Vallabha has his own metaphysics that doesn't. None of these corresponds with pre-existing Vedanta systems. So I would say that, I mean, and we can talk about exactly how they're different, but they are entirely independent systems.
So do you think that their intellectual difference, their innovation, or whatever you would like to call it, consists in this difference because they broke away from what was done in the first millennium?
I'm happy to say that it does, but again, I'm wary of taking too narrow a view of what counts as innovation.
Did these scholars respond? Sorry, did these scholars respond to the European philosophical challenge because they were being, probably they must have been denigrated as superstitious, as I don't know.
So it's interesting. I mean, reams have been written about, and Halfast writes about it, about how Sanskrit intellectuals can be a little bit, well, not a little bit, absolutely inward looking, and they very rarely. Uh, in the 19th, 20th century, I don't think anybody has really worked systematically on this. There are certain journals in which Sanskrit intellectuals are writing, and some of them do respond. I'm not an expert in this at all, but some of them do respond to certain ideas and Western traditions of philosophy. Uh, Tarkaratna refers to like some when he's talking about, I think, theodicy and rebirth. He does refer briefly to, just in a very generic way, to contemporary outsiders or contemporary, yeah, I think, yeah, contemporary outsiders, but nothing systematic. But there are some people who, when they were writing in certain journals, were talking about it. But eh, it's not a major thing that they do. You're right.
Don't you think this might hold some interest to us who are in the post-colonial situation? Because I suppose there is this hankering after a pre-colonial, non-Western influenced kind of philosophical culture.
Who's hankering after it? I mean, I certainly don't have this hankering. I mean, the figures that I'm talking to aren't actually in a pre-colonial context.
Mhm.
But
The fact that they don't grapple with Western European or I mean other philosophical traditions, don't you think that being absolutely silent does mean that they are still embedded in a pre-colonial intellectual culture?
well, again, some of the figures that I talk about, are they embedded in a pre-colonial intellectual culture? In some ways, yes, but again, we have a tendency when we talk about somebody in the 19th century to say either that there has been a break, there's been a rupture, and they're doing something completely new, and so they're modern, or to say that they're reactionary, but if I may, or to say that they're somehow relics or they're still in the pre-modern. I think the fact of them existing at a certain time, at least again, how do we want to define modernity, right? If modernity is a period, well, they exist in a modern period. If modernity refers to a set of tendencies, then it has very little to do with the period and it shouldn't present us with as much of an anomaly as it seems to. If you want to say that they're stuck in the pre-colonial, I'm not sure how to respond to that beyond to say that the pre-colonial is not a static thing either. And when they write in other languages, they do sometimes, I mean, they do extensively engage with things that are happening around them. Thank you.
Oh, actually, I just want to add to that Devata part.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. So normally, in Mimamsakas, they don't believe in Devatas because the same person similarly performing the same karma in the
Yeah, I mean,
same
that's
place.
one of the things that many
Yeah,
gods can't do.
many one person can't be good. For example, Indra and Swaha in the same time at 11:30 in Chennai and 11:30 at the same time in some other place. If they are going to perform, how can be the one person can be similar to two
Right.
places. So for that reason, they don't believe in that. Despite from mantras, there is no devatas. Is that correct?
That's one of the reasons, yes.
So then, in that case, don't they have any power to the if they believe on some certain power on mantras? So why can't they not? Again, it will be
What do you mean
either
power
again.
in mantras?
So, for example, it produce some kind of apurva.
Sure.
So that will continue to take him to that swarga afterward. So
Right.
that kind of metaphysical power mantra has. So why can't that same power? I mean, if we believe that one person,
Basically, if we can believe in Apurva, why can't we believe in Devatas?
yeah, similar, yeah,
Kalpana Gaurav.
exactly.
You postulate one weird thing. You
But
don't have to
Apurva
postulate
itself
it.
is Kalpana Gaurav.
But there's only you only have to postulate one kind of a thing, right?
But
Instead
what
of
is
also-
the nature of the Apurva? You have to bring so many elements to the nature of Apurva.
in the sense?
In the sense, like for example, there are certain Apurvas that will produce you like Putra Kamo Yajeta, Swarga Kamo
Right,
Yajeta. So you so many.
I mean, that's the Vedanta response in the Brahma Sutra.
Actually,
Well,
that's my
yeah,
premise.
yeah.
Even in Darshan Purana Masayana, so one person has to the big Apurva is going to be produced after the month. One
Right.
Darsha has to be
You have to do darshan and then you do the
and
Purnamasi.
Purnamasa. The both together till in between there will be a Khanda Apurva. So you still there one yaga will produce one Khanda Apurva on one certain day, and another yaga will produce another Khanda Apurva on some another. I mean, which is Paurani.
Yeah.
After that, combiningly is going to be a Mahapurva, Vigapurva.
Right.
So itself it is even it's a Kalpana, right?
Right.
What is the Prama? I mean, so we don't have an answer for.
I mean, Apurva is a made up Mimamsa thing. It doesn't ever occur in Shruti. They made it up. But your point
Actually,
is that
why do
why are they so opposed to gods when they're not opposed to the Apurva? That's your question, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I think one reason. Sorry?
I thought you said it yesterday.
That-
The fact that how can I say, they derive, if this person was there in time, then
Yes.
that's the,
I mean,
because
that's-
pillar of the.
But I mean, I guess the question is, but they believe in one unseen thing, so why can't they believe in unseen gods as well, right? I would say that Apurva is also not something that you can see, right? Whereas if gods are there, you have to either imagine that they have all these different attributes, then you get into the trouble, like I said, with Arthavada of all the descriptions, then you get into the trouble with the wars, then you have to take factual statements seriously, then you have to admit that the Veda has a date when it was composed, and then of course there is a complete viplava of the Tantra.
So just to add to his point, if the Apurva is agreed because of Bhavana Artha Bhakti, so Bhavana
Yeah,
Artha Panna
Yes.
is the status of
Yes.
Apurva, then the Shadhi Bhavana Artha Panna is the status of the Deva. So the equal argument, because the Samhitas speak of different natures of the divine beings, where the because it's not injunctive in nature, so the Mimamsakas are trying their best
Exactly.
and hard to say that that's Arthavada Vakya because it's not injunctive. Other than that aspect of the uh, so-called categorical imperativity of the Veda Vakyas, they are somehow using the Arthapati to prove, to convince the Arti Bhavana and the Shabdi Bhavana, the Veda and the Yagas, they are going to that extent. As you called it, the Mimamsa, Apurva doesn't exist ontologically other than the Mimamsa's meta worldview. So then why not struggle to the same extent to
Establish Devatas?
establish Devatas, because it's already Shakti Bhavana has already given you the status of the Devatas.
Again,
It's
because
not like something
I
that
think
you
the
are
big
creating
problem,
new.
the big problem with Devatas is that you have to then, again, you could say that they're Arthapana, but you would have to admit um, Arthavadas as real, and also remember that they are fighting the Buddhists in some way, right? So if you begin to accept Arthavadas as real, and then if you also begin to accept factual statements in the Veda, their only real case against Buddhist Dhamma is that the Veda always existed exactly as it is. You cannot afford even the tiniest bit of deviation in that, right?
If you destroy this entire system,
Then it's,
collapse.
yeah. Of course, there is that fun passage in Dharmakirti I was talking about yesterday, where Dharmakirti says, sure, your Vedas existed, but you guys interpret it. How do you know that it tells you to perform a sacrifice and not to eat dog meat?
Dharmakirti is a bit, on the Brahmin is a bit harsh.
He's great. I love him.
No, but what's interesting about this debate is this exact same debates happening in Europe about Christ's body and how can he be in 1,000 churches at the same time and all that. And in fact, what's interesting is there's colonialism happening. So the Protestants and Catholic Catholics can compare with eating the body of Christ. Like
Yeah.
it was polemical, but also real.
Yeah.
But I'm saying it has some consequence in the world. I guess what is still I'm not. I know it's unfair comparison, but here this has no consequence. It seems
No,
like
you're right. Yes.
these
Mimamsa
are-
has never made a difference. It
No,
doesn't
all
even have,
seems
it
to
doesn't
have
even
no
have
representation.
consequence for ritual in some ways.
Yeah, that's all. Okay.
Mimamsa exists as an entirely useless system. in that
So
sense.
all for this whole conversation, the Madhva
Yeah,
versus like it is no revelation. I mean, it's amazing.
Okay, I will say this. Some of it doesn't and some of it does, right? So, for example, Yamuna's Agama, I mean, now we're not talking, I'm assuming, with the early modern anymore, we're just talking about Sanskrit philosophy in general. Yamuna's Agama Pramanya has very real consequences in the world where people doing Pancharatra practices, people engaging with the Arla compositions become part of the Vedic mainstream, right? And that has then the reverse consequence that more people who are not part of the Vedic mainstream have have increasing opportunity to certain kinds of salvific practices, right? So that is, I mean, but I will say
But
this.
still,
but
even that,
however-
even then, the real consequences are soteriological. And
yes,
not
and I
social.
mean I agree that there are.
And it's moving from 0.0001 to 0.0001.
I mean these are okay.
So, I mean,
these
it's
are
very unfair,
Brahmana
I
men
agree.
talking
Yeah.
to each other with land
no,
rights.
but I'm saying this is true in Europe. They're all theologians, but at some point there's the so it's unfair. I guess what I was relevant to this earlier, I was asking, these are and I'm very sympathetic to the overall project of yours, like to complete. No, I'm
I
saying
mean I'm
to
less sympathetic to it
deflate
now than I was 5 years ago.
When I'm saying this deflating this idea of modernity and what is the big innovation and and all that is really not helpful. So I think if they really increase the circle of authority of like text from let's say from the other languages or from all these other communities, that would for me be like a real.
No, I mean that's
So
open.
that
Yes, that door was
so-
opened already by Yamuna.
So I'm saying so if that happened did that ever happen or when did
Sure.
it?
I mean, so the first move, like I said, was Turn of the Millennium with Yamunacharya, Ramanuja's teacher's teacher. Um,
So how is it? He's a what is it?
so here's I'm not an expert in this at all, but from what I understand of Vishishtadvaita and Sri Vaishnava traditions, both terms which are later than the 10th century, they bring together three streams, right? Unlike Shankara, so in fact, I think even Shankara is bringing together two, but that's a separate conversation. They bring together the Upanishad with the Tamil Veda with the Pancharatra Tantras, right? And in some ways, of course, Kumarila inadvertently left that door open, which brought all of this in. And then of course you would have Puranas be taken more and more seriously. Within the kind of Brahmanical mainstream, if you will, Tantras begin to be taken seriously by the 15th, 16th century at least. I'm not even talking about the Shaiva non-Buddhists. So that does happen. I mean, and also.
Non-Sanskrit texts. Okay, so then these are
sort of
colloquial Sanskrit
Vedic texts. Yeah,
So
colloquial
we
texts.
put it that way that they say that the subculture or the margins slowly get integrated. Right?
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
Like punk
I
is
mean,
integrated
Vedanta in the
mainstream.
7th century, 8th century, 9th century was a bit of a marginal subculture, which takes like basically until Sri Harsha to come into the mainstream. No offense.
In this,
And it doesn't really come into the proper mainstream until even later. Like, if the proper mainstream is Mimamsa, which is as it should be, it takes until the 16th. I'm not being serious anymore. Sorry.
But one, just to the not different, but one response to the whether the Indian intellectual cultures, being an I mean, curious about being an epistemologist is the Vedanta, particularly the Vedanta tradition, from the Shankara's time until the recent 21st century, that there has been n number of, for example, in this past 2,200 years, there has been more than 60 commentaries. Out of the 30, around 30 to 35 surviving distinct commentaries with distinct metaphysics to the Brahma Sutra tradition. They have, epistemologically speaking, their expositions. It's not, of course, you in your presentation yesterday and today there was a lot of theological aspects of it, but keeping that theology completely aside, is the physical and metaphysical aspects of the world. That has been one of the primary concerns of these Vedanta traditions in their exposition, and then also to respond to yours is not merely expository in nature of the original, because if you look at very deep in the commentaries, this is what I was also pointing out yesterday, they become independent monographs.
Yeah.
In the name of, they are commenting on the, so like for example, what is, what's error, what's truth, what is identity. So all these discussions have, they run for chapters and pages extensively, where they have kept, even if it is coming from Brahma Sutra, they have kept the God and the others completely, the entire theological aspect completely out of the picture, and then only deal with identity. So there is n number of, in this past 2,200 years, there are n number of content that's produced. However, the translations and then the research on them in the mainstream era is marginal.
I mean, this is fascinating because it might be very interesting to unearth these portions and make them available to a larger audience.
Yes, that approach happens.
I'm going to put 3 years on 20 leaves of one manuscript.
I can submit like Srini, what is it's like a lot of analytic philosophy in the 20th century, but just has no social.
Yeah, it's
But-
exactly,
but-
it's exactly
but,
like that.
no social.
It's
That's why I
exactly like
use the word physical and metaphysical.
But I agree with you that I mean what I was saying before was that not only so, but like I say, Mimamsa doesn't have ritual consequences even. Nobody ever goes to Mimamsa to decide how to perform a ritual. Everybody knows. Mimamsa is about how that sentence means what we want for it to mean.
Yeah, so
So it's about hermeneutics and the interpretation.
Did people like Matilal and Mohanty and all of these people do these things? I don't know. I mean,
They do these things in the
you know what you said, the discussions on identity, on self-worth.
I'm going to get another one.
It's for you.
All of the body was for me. I don't know for everyone in the room.
So the discussions that you mentioned, Sri, that these are chapters to whether deal with concepts that are epistemologically and ontologically important.
Oh.
Did people like Matilal and Mohanty?
You can
Should I answer and should I type out the answer or should I?
No, you can.
Okay. Female practitioners of Sri Vidya, there are, I mean, in terms of mythical or legendary, of course, we have Lopamudra. There are lots of contemporary Sri Vidya practitioners. There is this eligibility of women is there in some strands of Sri Vidya, but there are no, to my knowledge, authors in Sri Vidya that are women in the pre-modern context.
Just because there's been a lot said, that I think there are little points that could be added just for the sake of knowledge to what Arvind had mentioned. Also, when I talked of Devata, I just meant they exist at least in the mantras, right? The mantras say "O Indra," or
Yeah.
so that.
Yeah.
I just meant that.
Sure.
The fact it's there means it's in the culture for them. And if
Sure.
you believe in that, that's
Yeah.
not my point.
Okay.
So I just meant
Sure.
there's no denying that there is Indra, Rudra, and so forth in the Vedas.
Like the Buddha, there's no Buddhist religion in Mimosa.
But I mean, to that extent, the Devatas exist in the Pali canon as well.
Yeah, obviously, that's a shared.
I mean, that's part of the shared, yeah.
Yeah, that's a shared background, but the rejection comes from somewhere else, right? Atman, for example, that's
In the Vedas.
well, from the Buddhism, they do that. But also, when we talk about the critique or something, that's coming back to Arvind, so you ask if the people in the pre-modern and then modern era, they engage with, the European philosophy, or even you can ask, do they engage with, Mediterranean religion, right? Because this has been asked, it's scholarship on that. Actually, for doxography, it's relevant, right? Do doxographers engage with non-Dharma
Yeah.
system, right? And that's for anybody interested in doxography will come to you as a question, and then the answer is no, and then the why. Then there are different lines of going as to why. I think that's relevant. One of the best, it seems, that photographers are interested in systems that leads to liberation. If you don't talk about liberation, there is no need
Yeah.
to talk about you. That's it. But Blomkamp makes an interesting point in, and I think it's a bottom page note in his book. He has this massive book on why the Kohanim won,
Yeah.
right? And it's very hard to read because it's not a single, it's just collection, but kind of patchwork of. But in one of them, he has this observation on the rejection of urban setting in Brahmanical thought, right? Brahmins don't like cities, right? And then it's an interesting point. It's kind of show that how do Brahmin, at least in that more classical context, criticize, right? Instead of, if you want to go about criticizing cities, what they do is that they pretend they don't exist, right? So in a Brahmanical manner, if you don't like cities, you just pretend they're not there. So, and it's interesting, so that you won't find much urban setting in a proper Brahmanical text or discussions and so forth. It's always, the cow with the hoof in the forest and the hermitage and so forth, but it's not, the baker in the.
It's like, I mean, I always find, sorry.
Well, just to finish, but that's why it's a bottom page, no? Because he makes then a reference. He says, another people did the same with urban settings were Nazis, right? The Nazis disliked the urban settings, so that their art always depicted nature, this and that, and their way for the, at least early, if you want, there is such a period, early urban, as an early Nazi art, would be this kind of ideal nature setting, and their way to criticize them was just to pretend it's not there. And I think it's an interesting case of urbanism, but I think we can find that in other instances. We can take this as an example, for it's not just urbanism. So when they don't like something, instead of giving it credit, because if you talk about it, it's like jurisprudence. Now it starts to be real, right? It's there in the text, and then somebody will comment, what do you mean by this and that and that and that? You create you give it reality. And so it's that, the best way is to not talk about it. And if you think of scholarship today, the best way you can do, to deal with your enemies is not to criticize them. To pretend they are there. And theologians do that all the time. If they don't like somebody, this person never wrote a book. I don't know. Right? I leave that to you, but I think that's an interesting point to bring. It's a form of criticism.
They don't even write about families. They don't write about anything.
But
Well, I mean, okay, one second. We're talking about Shastrans here. There is a lot more to Sanskrit intellectual culture. If you read Bana, right? The opening of the Harshacharita, where he's talking about his family.
That's not, not the literary text, but it's not woven into.
well, these are metaphysical things. They're dealing with metaphysical content. I mean, if you read Nibandas,
No,
what
but
she's working
you're
on,
entirely
Veda
right
and
in
others,
saying that.
they would deal with
But I think my question was submerged that time. Did people like Matilal and Mohanty and Daya Krishna, all of these people, Ganeri, have they dealt with these, these passages, these sections on identity, on, other concerns that modern epistemology or ontology
So, I mean,
has?
there's a lot of work now, not only in these authors, but in contemporary people who do whatever the latest term is, global philosophy, I think is what we are going with these days. People who do global philosophy, cross-cultural philosophy, they do talk, they have, especially people who do analytic philosophy, have found a lot to say, lot to engage with in, for example, in Abhinaya or in kind of, in certain strands of Alankara and things like that. So yes, people have been working on it. Yeah.
So major problem here at the moment when we say Indian philosophy or Sanskrit philosophy that gets limited to these mainstream what we were discussing yesterday about Alankara and Vyakarana
Yeah.
and Dharma Shastra and other paramparas, that not being within the Sanskrit orthodoxical world, that also being a philosophical as contents that exist there. That we not being mainstream is the major concern for these questions to arise, whether there is a social or real time world.
I think we have a first order problem. These are also the downstream. We have the first problem is that, let's face it, Advaita Vedanta, which is so widely studied and everybody wants to do Advaita Vedanta, middle period Advaita Vedanta is still woefully understudied. I think we don't yet have a good handle on how these corpora are operating, maybe. And
One question, maybe if we can be, now major question is that
These are the
towards
minor
Appaya,
questions.
Appaya is uh, some of the researchers who are traditional and non-traditional, most of the researchers have this perspective towards Appaya is that until the Appaya period, the Advaita tradition, particularly the Shankaradvaita tradition, including the Shankara himself, it's not clear whether he was Shakta or Vaishnava because he's considered Shanmata Sthapanacharya and so on. So, and in his Gita Bhasha and other texts, he appears to be Vaishnava.
Yeah, I
who
mean, I
also,
think hasn't Hacker argued somewhere that he was in a Vaishnava milieu?
and so, isn't it the Appaya the one who creates this kind of transition of the entire Advaita Parampara to become Shaiva?
I mean, as late as Iyer in the 18th century, he says that that Ekadeshiyas in the Shankara tradition are Shaiva, right? So it seems that the idea that there are other kinds of allegiances possible is familiar to Ayyana at least, which is by my count, a couple hundred years after Appaya. I think there is and again, I'm not an expert on this. Elian Fisher is, amongst other people. Duquette is. To my mind, there is a larger process with the way the Veerashaivas, or sort of the Shakti Vishishta Shiva Advaita types are engaging with Advaita Vedanta and how that is inflecting Advaita Vedanta. There is a kind of, yeah, so I think Shiva in general has broader purchase. I think Appaya is a figure. I'm not sure if he has single handedly set up Advaita Vedanta as Shiva. Also, I don't know if Appaya, what kind of influence Appaya had in mathas and so on. I've never seen any evidence that.
But maybe textually.
Textually, maybe, yeah.
I mean, recently I was pointing out to one of our students, Harsha, that this Chandradit Sharma has a study on Advaita and various contradictory schools, the Bauddhas and the Shiva, the Kashmir Shaivas, and even which was the other one? Harsha? Yeah, I forget. So
Buddha.
no, Bauddha I mentioned. So yeah, so Advaita tradition in all these different schools. I don't know, what you may have to say about that.
I mean, it's like asking somebody who works on like 17th century Western philosophy what they think about like the 8th century. I have opinions, but I'm not competent to comment with any.
Yeah, I mean, you must understand that my knowledge is very patchy, so
Not at all, no, but I'm just saying, I feel like when one is a Sanskritist, one is expected to be all of Sanskrit forever. It's
Sure,
not, that's not what I do.
It's very fascinating your edition. Are you an historian? Because it's also, I'm just curious, disciplinarity. Because in India, you take through history, right? Which is,
I mean,
we don't have a religious studies.
We don't.
So it's interesting.
I mean, my disciplinary identity right now is complicated and in transit. I'm not sure where I'm going to end up.
Just one fun question is that how would you?
These are not fun questions.
One I said, so that means others pay. So, how would you translate? Because you said your discipline is in that gray area. How would you? What is the term that you would like? How would you translate the term religion in Sanskrit?
I won't.
She wouldn't even accept the word spirituality, so there you have it.
I didn't reject it. I was just curious what you meant by it. Ujjan? Am I being asked to move? Can I keep sitting? What's happening?
I'll take
Don't take it.
But
Bravo.
Just tell me.
Another question.
Oh, sorry. Can Ramakrishna have a question? I mean, there are kinds and kinds of Shakta Tantra, and how they differ is it's easier to sort through in text than in practice. But I mean, I think Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa was a Shakta practitioner. I'm not sure if it's in those practices seem more in alignment with Kali Kula than Shri Kula for what that is worth. I don't know if that at all clarifies anything. It's been a couple hours. I'm running out of steam.
Or at least you had sleep.
I'm running out of steam. Yesterday I was running on 3 hours of sleep and 35 hours of travel. I wasn't all there. Do you want to?
Yeah.
I feel like you were doing something. Sorry.
Namaste. On the behalf of the Department of Philosophy, Mahe, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to everyone who made today's session a success. Our deepest thanks to Dr. Tarini Avesti for her enriching and thought-provoking lecture playing with philosophy, some observation on the late second millennium in India. Your reflections on philosophical play has truly opened new avenues for the thought and dialogue. We're also grateful to all the participants, both online and offline, for your presence, attention, and engagement. Your thoughtful participation adds meaning to such academic gatherings. A warm thanks to our faculty members, research scholars, and students for their support, and to the Misha team for their impeccable coordination. We also thank Mahe for nurturing an academic culture that values critical inquiry and the study of Indian knowledge systems. Let us carry the insights from today's session into our future studies and conversations with depth, curiosity, and openness to the new ways of thinking. Thank you once again, and we look forward to your presence in the sessions ahead.
Question: have you decided what you want to read tomorrow?
Katalpadikaram, and you said that.
So that's what I'm saying. Do you want to, we can also read either Bhavana or Arthavad if you prefer that.
Fine.
I feel like that might be, I don't know, you might have more fun with it.
Okay.
Bhavana, is that what you're doing?
What does it say?
Excellent, let's do Bhavana, that's what it is. I'll send
Because he's
the,
working in an agency, so.
I'll send the text to some email ID and then it can be circulated.
Yeah, any email.
I'll send it to you.
You sent the one that is the same.
But no, I'm sending, I think let's read Bhavartha then. That's, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming.
And,
Thank you everyone. We'll meet again tomorrow at 9:30.
How is it different from other?
It's